Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a quiet principality that no longer appears on any modern map. A place that once existed between the edges of memory and the slow drift of time, where hills rolled gently into mist and the sound of distant bells marked hours that no one hurried through. In this forgotten land lived a prince whose name has been softened by centuries into something almost unrecognizable. And yet, the traces of his life remain not in grand monuments or celebrated victories, but in something far more subtle, far more enduring. His story does not begin with power, nor with war, nor even with ambition. It begins, instead, with silence. The principality itself was small, tucked between larger empires that barely acknowledged its existence. Traders passed through without stopping. Armies marched around it rather than through it. And even scholars rarely found reason to write about it. It was the kind of place that existed simply because no one had taken the time to erase it. The prince, born into this quiet obscurity, grew up surrounded by routines that never changed. Mornings came with the same pale light stretching over stone courtyards. Servants moved in familiar patterns. Meals were prepared with the same ingredients, arranged in the same way. Even the wind, it seemed, followed a schedule, brushing past the palace walls at predictable hours. From a young age, he noticed this repetition. At first, it comforted him. There was a certain peace in knowing exactly what would happen next. But as he grew older, that peace began to feel like something else, something closer to confinement. It was during one of these slow, uneventful afternoons that he first discovered the existence of the library, not the grand royal archive that every palace possessed, filled with genealogies and official records. That place he already knew well, and it held little interest for him. This was something different, something hidden. He found it by accident, as many important discoveries tend to happen. A narrow corridor, rarely used, extended beyond the servants' quarters. It seemed ordinary at first, just another passage lined with aging stone. But at the far end, partially obscured by a hanging tapestry, there was a door. It did not look important. In fact, it looked almost deliberately unimportant. The wood was plain. The handle was worn. There were no guards, no markings, no indication that anything of value lay beyond it. And yet, for reasons he could not fully explain, the prince paused. Perhaps it was the way the air felt slightly cooler near the door, or the faint scent of something old, something dry, like paper that had not been touched in years. Or perhaps it was simply the quiet insistence of curiosity, something that had been slowly building inside him without his noticing. He opened the door. What he found inside did not match any expectation he might have had. The room was not large, but it extended deeper than it first appeared, shelves lining the walls in uneven rows. Dust hung in the air, catching the faint light that filtered through a narrow window set high above. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. It was heavier, more complete. Books filled the shelves, though not in any organized way. Some were stacked horizontally, others leaned at odd angles, as though placed there without much care. Many looked older than anything he had seen before, their bindings faded, their pages uneven. There was no sign that anyone had visited this place in a very long time. The prince stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft, almost reluctant sound. At first, he did nothing more than stand there, taking in the stillness. It felt as though he had stepped into a place that existed outside the normal flow of time. The routines of the palace, the predictable rhythms of daily life, all seemed distant now. He reached out and touched one of the books. A thin layer of dust lifted into the air. He opened it carefully. The text inside was unfamiliar, not entirely unreadable, but written in a style that suggested a different era, perhaps even a different way of thinking. The sentences were longer, more winding. The ideas seemed less concerned with clarity and more with something else, something harder to define. He did not understand everything he read, but that did not discourage him. In fact, it had the opposite effect. For the first time in his life, he encountered something that did not immediately reveal itself. Something that required patience, attention, and perhaps even a willingness to accept uncertainty. He sat down on the floor, the book resting in his hands, and began to read more carefully. Hours passed without his noticing. The light in the room shifted slowly, changing from pale morning brightness to the softer tones of late afternoon. Dust continued to drift through the air, undisturbed except for the occasional movement of his hand as he turned a page. When he finally looked up, he realized how much time had passed, and yet, instead of feeling tired, he felt something else. Awake, not in the physical sense, but in a way that was new to him. As though a part of his mind, long dormant, had begun to stir. He returned to the library the next day, and the day after that. At first, no one noticed his absence during those quiet hours. The routines of the palace were so predictable that small deviations often went unremarked. A prince spending time alone was not unusual. A prince reading, even less so. But what no one realized was that the nature of his reading had changed. He was no longer studying the official histories, the carefully preserved narratives that reinforced the structure of his world. Instead, he was exploring something far less controlled. The books in the hidden library were different. Some were incomplete, their pages missing or damaged. Others contained annotations written in margins by hands long gone. There were contradictions between texts, disagreements left unresolved, ideas presented without conclusion. It was, in a way, chaotic. And yet, within that chaos, the prince began to notice patterns. kind that repeated predictably, like the routines of the palace, but subtler patterns, connections between ideas, echoes of thought that appeared in different texts, separated by time and authorship. It was as though the library itself was engaged in a quiet conversation, one that had been ongoing for generations. And now he had become part of it. He began to take notes. At first, they were simple observations, small attempts to make sense of what he was reading. But gradually, they grew more complex. He started to compare texts, to question assumptions, to consider possibilities that extended beyond the boundaries of his upbringing. The world, which had once seemed so stable and predictable, began to shift. Not visibly. The palace remained the same. The routines continued. The servants moved as they always had. The meals were prepared in the same way. But beneath that surface, something had changed. The prince no longer saw his surroundings as fixed. He began to notice details he had previously ignored. Small inconsistencies, subtle variations in behavior, the way certain decisions were made without explanation, the way certain topics were avoided in conversation. It was not that these things were new. They had always been there. But now he was paying attention. One evening, as he sat in the library with a particularly worn manuscript spread open before him, he came across a passage that seemed different from the others. It was not written in the same style. The language was more direct, almost urgent. The handwriting, too, appeared different, as though added later. He leaned closer, reading slowly. The passage did not describe events, nor did it present an argument. Instead, it posed a question, a simple question, but one that lingered. It asked whether knowledge, once hidden, ever truly remains forgotten, or whether it simply waits for someone willing to look for it. The prince read the line several times. There was something unsettling about it, not because it was frightening, but because it suggested something he had not yet fully considered, that the library itself might not be accidental, that its obscurity might be intentional. He closed the book gently. For the first time since discovering the hidden room, he felt a slight hesitation, a pause, not enough to stop him, but enough to make him wonder. And as the light in the room dimmed, and the shadows along the shelves grew longer, the silence of the library seemed to deepen, as though it were holding something back, waiting. The prince remained seated for a long time after closing the book, his hand still resting lightly on its worn cover, as though removing it might disturb something delicate that had only just begun to take shape. The silence in the room no longer felt entirely passive. It carried a quiet tension now, subtle but undeniable, like a question that had been asked but not yet answered. He glanced toward the shelves. Until that moment, he had treated the library as a place of discovery, an accumulation of forgotten thoughts waiting to be uncovered. But now, a different idea began to form, slower and less comfortable. What if the books were not simply forgotten? What if they had been set aside, not lost by accident, but moved deliberately away from the rest of the world, placed here where they could exist without interruption, without influence, or perhaps without consequence? The thought did not frighten him exactly, but it shifted the way he looked at everything around him. He stood up and began to walk slowly along the shelves, this time not searching for something new to read, but observing more carefully. The arrangement of the books, which had once seemed random, now appeared almost intentional in its disorder. Certain texts were grouped together, though not obviously so. Some sections of the shelves were more worn than others, as if accessed more frequently at some point in the past. He paused at one corner where the wood of the shelving had darkened slightly, polished not by recent use, but by repeated contact long ago. Someone had spent time here, not just briefly, but consistently, and not just anyone. Someone who had known where to look. The prince reached for a nearby volume, thicker than most, its spine cracked in several places. As he opened it, a small fragment of parchment slipped out and drifted to the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was not part of the original book. The texture was different, thinner, and the writing on it was more compact, as though meant to conserve space. The ink had faded unevenly, but enough remained to be legible. It was a list, not of titles, as he first expected, but of names. Some were familiar, minor figures mentioned in official histories, advisors, scholars, individuals who had briefly appeared in the records before fading into obscurity. Others he did not recognize at all. Beside each name, there were markings, small symbols repeated in different combinations. He studied them for a moment, trying to find a pattern, but nothing revealed itself immediately. Still, the presence of the list raised another question. Why record names here, in a hidden library, separate from official archives? And why attach symbols instead of explanations? He folded the parchment carefully and placed it inside his own notes. It felt important, though he could not yet say why. As he continued moving through the room, he began to notice something else, small irregularities that had escaped his attention before. A gap between two shelves that seemed slightly wider than necessary. A section of wall where the stone color shifted almost imperceptibly. A faint draft of air where there should have been none. He approached the wall slowly. At first glance, it appeared solid, no different from the rest of the room. But when he placed his hand against it, he felt a subtle difference in temperature. Cooler, and beneath that, something else. A faint vibration, almost too slight to detect. He pressed gently. Nothing happened. He stepped back, considering. If the library had been intentionally hidden, it would not be unreasonable to assume that parts of it remained concealed even within itself. The idea did not feel dramatic. It felt consistent. He glanced around the room once more. as though expecting some clue to reveal itself. But the library remained unchanged, quiet and patient. Waiting, he returned to the table where he had been sitting and began to review his notes. At first, they seemed scattered observations, fragments of ideas, questions without answers. But as he read through them again, he began to notice connections he had not seen before, references to absence, mentions of knowledge withheld, repeated suggestions across different texts that what was recorded publicly represented only a fraction of what was known. It was not a single argument, nor a unified theory. It was something more diffuse, more subtle, a pattern of omission. He added a new note, writing slowly and deliberately. Not everything is hidden by being concealed. Some things are hidden by being excluded. He paused after writing the sentence, reading it again. It felt incomplete, but not incorrect. Outside the library, the palace continued its routines. Evening approached in its usual, predictable way. Lamps would be lit. Servants would move through the corridors carrying trays and messages. Conversations would take place, polite and measured, repeating familiar topics. None of that had changed. And yet, for the prince, everything felt slightly altered, not in a way that could be pointed to directly, but in the way one might notice that a familiar room feels different after a single object has been moved, even if that object cannot immediately be identified. He closed his notebook and stood once more. This time, he returned to the section of wall he had examined earlier. Instead of pressing against it, he began to study the surrounding area more carefully. The shelves nearby were uneven, not in their construction, but in their placement. One extended slightly further forward than the others. He reached for it and applied a small amount of pressure. At first, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, there was a shift, a soft sound, like wood settling after a long period of stillness. The shelf moved, not outward, but inward, pivoting slightly on a hidden axis. Behind it, a narrow space revealed itself. The opening was not large, just enough for a person to pass through if they turned slightly. Beyond it, darkness extended further than he could immediately see. The prince did not hesitate for long. Curiosity, which had guided him this far, remained stronger than uncertainty. He stepped forward and entered the passage. The air inside was cooler, more enclosed. The scent of old paper was replaced by something else, stone, perhaps, or simply the absence of circulation. He moved slowly, one hand trailing along the wall to guide his path. After a few steps, the passage widened slightly, opening into another room. This one was different from the library he had grown familiar with. Smaller, more contained, and far more orderly. Shelves lined the walls here as well, but unlike the outer room, everything was arranged with precision. Books stood upright, evenly spaced. No dust covered their surfaces. No pages were bent or damaged. It was as though this room had been maintained, even while the outer library had been allowed to fall into quiet neglect. In the center of the room stood a single table. On it rested a collection of objects, not just books, but instruments, tools, items whose purpose was not immediately clear. The prince approached slowly. There was a sense, not of danger, but of significance, as though this room represented something different from the rest of the library. Not forgotten, preserved. He reached out and picked up one of the books. The cover was plain, but newer than anything he had seen in the outer room. He opened it. The writing inside was precise, structured, and unmistakably intentional. This was not a record of ideas. It was a record of observations, detailed, methodical, and ongoing. He turned a page, then another, and gradually a realization began to form. This was not just a hidden collection of old knowledge. It was a continuation. Someone had been here after the library was forgotten. Someone had not only read the texts, but expanded upon them, added to them, carried their ideas forward. The prince felt a quiet shift within himself as he stood in that small, carefully maintained room. Until now, the library had felt like a relic of the past. But this suggested something else entirely, that the story he had begun to uncover was not finished, that it had continued quietly, beyond the awareness of the world outside, and perhaps most unsettling of all, that he was not the first to find it. The thought did not bring fear, but it did bring a new kind of awareness, a sense that his presence here might not be entirely unexpected. As he closed the book and looked around the room once more, the silence felt different again, not empty, not waiting, but aware, and for the first time since opening the hidden door, the prince considered a possibility he had not allowed himself to fully entertain, that somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, or perhaps even within them, someone else might already know he was here. The prince remained still in the center of the smaller room, the book still held in his hands, though he was no longer reading it. The thought that had entered his mind did not leave quickly. It lingered, settling into the quiet space around him as naturally as the still air. Someone else might already know. It was not a conclusion, not yet. It was only a possibility, but it was enough to change the way he stood, the way he listened, the way he noticed the smallest details. He became aware of his own breathing. Too loud. He adjusted it, slower now, quieter. The room offered no immediate response. No movement. No sound beyond the faint, distant stillness that seemed to define this hidden space. And yet, the sense of presence did not disappear entirely. It was not something he could locate or confirm. It existed only as a subtle tension, like the feeling of being observed without evidence. He placed the book back on the table, aligning it carefully with the others. instinctively preserving the order he had found. If someone had arranged this room with such precision, then disorder would not go unnoticed. That realization felt important. He stepped back and began to study the objects on the table more closely. There were instruments he did not immediately recognize, small metal devices with rotating parts, pieces of glass set into narrow frames, a series of thin rods marked with faint measurements. They did not resemble anything from the official halls of the palace. These were not ceremonial. They were functional, used for observation, perhaps, or calculation. He reached for one of the glass-framed pieces and held it up toward the dim light. The surface distorted what little illumination there was, bending it slightly, focusing it into a sharper line along the edge, a tool for seeing differently. He lowered it slowly. The idea returned. This room was not meant for preservation alone. It was meant for continuation, for refining, adjusting, testing, for looking at the same world and finding something else within it. He moved toward the shelves. Unlike the outer library, where books felt scattered and layered over time, here the arrangement suggested sequence. Not alphabetical, not by size, but by progression. Each volume seemed to follow from the previous one, as though they had been placed in deliberate order by someone tracking their own thoughts. He pulled one from the middle. The pages inside were filled with tightly written text, far more structured than the older manuscripts. Diagrams appeared between paragraphs, simple at first, then increasingly complex as he turned the pages. Shapes repeated, altered slightly each time. Lines intersected, diverged, then reconnected. It was not immediately clear what they represented, but they were not random. He turned to a later section. There, the writing shifted, less descriptive, more reflective, shorter passages, each followed by a pause in the text, as though the writer had stopped, considered, then continued with a new thought, rather than completing the previous one. The prince read one passage slowly. It described the difficulty of distinguishing between absence and concealment. Another spoke of patterns that only became visible when viewed indirectly. A third suggested that systems, once understood, could be influenced without being altered directly. He paused after reading that line. There was something unsettling about it, not because it was threatening, but because it implied a level of awareness that extended beyond observation, influence without alteration, change without visibility. He closed the book gently and returned it to its place. The room felt quieter now, though not empty, more complete somehow, as though each object, each text, contributed to a larger structure that did not need to announce itself. He turned back toward the passage he had entered through. The narrow opening remained as it was, partially concealed behind the shifted shelf. Beyond it, the darker corridor led back to the outer library, the place that now felt, by comparison, almost unfinished. He considered returning, not out of hesitation, but to re-examine what he had already seen in light of this new understanding. But before he could move, something caught his attention. A sound, soft, so faint that he might have dismissed it, if not for the silence that surrounded it. It came from behind him, not from the table, not from the shelves he had just examined, from somewhere deeper within the room. He turned slowly. At first, nothing appeared different. The walls remained still, the objects undisturbed. But then he noticed it, a slight irregularity in the far corner. Not movement exactly, but a difference in shadow. He stepped closer. The wall there did not align perfectly with the rest of the room. It angled inward slightly, creating a narrow recess that had been easy to overlook at first glance. He approached it carefully. The sound did not repeat, but the memory of it remained. He reached out and traced the edge of the recess with his fingers. The stone felt smoother here, less worn, as though it had been shaped more recently than the surrounding structure. There was a seam, barely visible. He pressed against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the section of wall shifted inward, revealing another hidden space. This one was smaller still, more confined, and entirely empty, at least at first glance. No shelves, no table, only a single object placed at the center of the floor. A chair, simple in design, wooden, unadorned, positioned so that it faced the entrance directly. The prince hesitated, not out of fear, but because the simplicity of the scene felt deliberate in a way that was difficult to interpret. Everything else in the hidden rooms had suggested purpose through complexity, layers of thought, systems of arrangement, accumulation of knowledge. This suggested something else. Focus. He stepped inside. The air here felt different. Not colder, not warmer, but still in a way that felt more complete, as though even the slightest movement had been removed from it. He circled the chair slowly. There were no markings on it, no signs of wear beyond what might be expected from occasional use. It did not appear ancient, nor new. It simply existed, waiting. He stopped in front of it. The position, facing the entrance, meant that anyone sitting there would be looking directly at the place he now stood, or more precisely, at whoever entered. The realization settled quietly. This was not a place for storing knowledge. It was a place for receiving something, or for observing. He glanced back toward the passage leading out. For a brief moment, the thought returned stronger now, that he might not be alone in this discovery, that someone at some point had sat in this chair, perhaps recently, perhaps long ago, and perhaps would again. The prince looked at the chair once more. Then slowly, he lowered himself into it. The wood was cool beneath him. The room did not change immediately. No sound followed. No movement no visible reaction to his presence. And yet, as he sat there, facing the narrow opening through which he had entered, a subtle shift began to take place, not in the room itself, but in his awareness of it. The silence deepened, not emptier, but more defined, as though it now had edges. Structure. He became aware of the passage behind him, the room beyond it, the layers of space he had moved through to arrive here. And beyond that, the palace, its routines, its predictable rhythms, all still continuing, unchanged, but now separated from him by something more than distance, separated by understanding. He did not know how long he remained seated. Time in that space did not move in the same way. Moments did not pass so much as accumulate, and within that accumulation, a quiet certainty began to form, not about the library, not about the hidden rooms, but about something else, something simpler, that his discovery was not the beginning and not the end, but part of something that had been unfolding quietly across time, waiting not to be found, but to be continued. The prince opened his eyes slightly wider, though he had not realized they had begun to relax. And in that moment, just at the edge of his awareness, he thought he heard something again, not from the walls, not from the passage, but from the direction of the outer library. A faint sound, measured, deliberate, like footsteps that did not belong to him. The prince did not rise immediately. The sound, if it had truly been a sound, lingered in his awareness, like the echo of something that refused to fully reveal itself. It had not been loud, nor distinct enough to identify with certainty, yet it carried a quality that separated it from the natural stillness of the hidden rooms. Measured, intentional, and most importantly, unfamiliar, he remained seated in the chair, his posture unchanged, as though movement might disturb the fragile clarity of the moment. His breathing slowed again, quieter now, almost blending into the silence itself. He listened. At first, nothing followed. The library, with all its layers and concealed spaces, returned to its usual stillness. The air did not shift. The walls did not respond. Even the faint, almost imperceptible sense of presence he had felt earlier seemed to withdraw slightly, as though observing from a greater distance. And yet, the awareness did not leave him. He had heard something, or believed he had, and belief, he realized, carried its own weight. After some time, he could not tell how long, the prince placed his hands gently on the arms of the chair and stood. The motion felt deliberate, not hurried, as though he were testing whether the world would respond to his movement. It did not. The room remained unchanged. He stepped back from the chair, his gaze lingering on it for a moment longer. There was something about it that now felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. Sitting there had altered his perception in a way that could not be easily reversed. The simplicity of the space, the focus it imposed, had stripped away distractions he had not realized he carried with him. He turned toward the narrow passage leading out of the small chamber. The faint sound he had perceived seemed to draw him forward, though not with urgency. It was not a call. It did not demand action. It simply existed as a possibility, one that he now chose to explore. He stepped into the passage. The confined space felt familiar now, less uncertain than before. His hand brushed lightly against the stone wall as he moved, guiding himself back toward the larger hidden room. When he emerged, the difference between the spaces became immediately apparent again. The ordered shelves, the table of instruments, the quiet precision of everything, it all felt subtly altered, not in structure, but in meaning. Before, he had seen this room as a continuation of knowledge. Now he began to see it as preparation for something beyond the act of reading. He paused near the table, glancing briefly at the objects he had examined earlier. The glass instruments, the measured rods, the carefully arranged volumes, they no longer seemed like endpoints of understanding, but tools within a process he did not yet fully understand. The faint sound did not repeat, but the memory of it guided him onward. He crossed the room and moved toward the narrow opening behind the shifted shelf. The passage back to the outer library appeared unchanged. A simple dark corridor leading into the space where he had first begun his exploration. He hesitated briefly before stepping through, not out of fear, but out of recognition that crossing this threshold again might not feel the same. He passed through the opening. The outer library greeted him with its familiar disorder, dust-laden shelves, uneven stacks of books, the soft diffusion of light through the high window. It was as he had left it, and yet it did not feel the same. The silence here was lighter, less structured, more open. Where the inner rooms had felt contained and intentional, this space felt scattered, as though its purpose had been allowed to fade over time. He stood still, listening again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, there it was, faint, but clearer now, a sound from deeper within the library, not from the direction of the hidden passage he had just exited, but from the far side of the room, near the shelves he had only briefly explored before. Footsteps, slow, measured. He did not move immediately. Instead, he allowed himself to observe. The sound did not approach directly. It moved parallel to his position, as though whoever or whatever was creating, it was navigating the shelves without urgency, not searching, not fleeing, simply moving. The prince felt no immediate fear, but he felt something else, a heightened awareness. Every detail in the room seemed sharper now, the angle of the light, the position of the books, the subtle shifts in shadow along the walls. He took a step forward. The floor beneath him made the slightest sound, a soft contact that seemed louder than it should have been in the surrounding quiet. The footsteps paused, not abruptly, but gradually, as though the movement had simply concluded. The silence that followed was different from before. Not empty, not neutral, but shared. The prince continued forward, his pace slow, deliberate. He did not attempt to conceal his movement, nor did he exaggerate it. He moved as naturally as the moment allowed. As he approached the far side of the library, the arrangement of the shelves became more irregular. Some leaned slightly. Others were set at angles that suggested they had been moved and not fully returned to their original positions. He turned a corner between two shelves and stopped. There was no one there, at least not in the way he had expected. The space beyond the shelves was empty, the floor undisturbed, the dust unshifted except for his own footprints. And yet, something was different. On one of the nearby shelves, a book stood slightly apart from the others, not dramatically, just enough to suggest it had been moved recently. He stepped closer. The book was one he recognized. He had seen it before, though he had not yet read it. Its position now, slightly forward, broke the otherwise uneven pattern of the surrounding volumes. He reached out and touched it. The surface was free of dust, recently handled. He pulled it from the shelf. As he opened it, a small piece of parchment fell from between the pages, drifting slowly to the floor. He bent down and picked it up. Unlike the fragment he had found earlier, this one was not old. The edges were sharp. The ink was dark, unfaded, and the writing was unmistakably recent. He read it. The message was short, direct, and written in a hand he did not recognize. "You are not the first to hear it." The prince read the line again, then once more. The words did not explain. They did not instruct. They simply acknowledged. He straightened slowly, the parchment still in his hand. The silence of the library settled around him once more, but it no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, not necessarily by a presence he could see or confront, but by something that had already intersected with his path. Someone who had left a trace, not hidden, but placed deliberately. He closed the book and returned it to the shelf, leaving it exactly as he had found it. Then he looked around the library again, this time not as an explorer, but as a participant. The patterns he had begun to notice, the omissions, the hidden structures, the continuation of thought, they all pointed towards something that extended beyond a single individual. This was not just a forgotten library. It was a space that had been used, quietly, repeatedly, across time, and now he was part of it. The prince folded the parchment and placed it carefully among his notes, not as an answer, but as a beginning. And as he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the shelves once more, he understood something with a clarity that had not been present before. He was no longer searching alone. Whether he would meet the one who had written the message, he could not yet know, but their presence, subtle, indirect, undeniable, had already altered the course of his discovery, and somewhere within the quiet depths of the library, beyond the reach of light and routine, the next movement in this unfolding story was already waiting, not hidden, but positioned for him to find. The prince did not leave the spot immediately after returning the book to its place. His hand lingered for a brief moment near the spine, as though expecting some subtle reaction from the shelf itself. But nothing changed. The arrangement remained still, the silence intact, the surrounding dust undisturbed except for the faint traces of his own movement. And yet, the message he had found did not settle easily. You are not the first to hear it. The phrasing was precise. Not see it asterisk, not find this place asterisk, but here it asterisk. The distinction felt deliberate, though its meaning was not yet entirely clear. It suggested that what mattered here was not simply discovery, but perception, an ability to notice something that others might overlook entirely. He stepped back slowly, allowing his gaze to move across the shelves once more. If someone else had been here recently, recent enough to leave a note with fresh ink, then the library was not as isolated as it had first appeared. The hidden rooms, the preserved texts, the tools for observation, none of it existed in complete abandonment. It was being used, quietly, carefully, perhaps even systematically. The prince began to walk again, this time without any clear destination, allowing instinct rather than curiosity to guide him. His movements were slower now, more deliberate. Each step felt less like exploration and more like participation in something already in motion. The library responded, as it always had with silence, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt layered, as though it contained traces of previous movements, previous thoughts, previous presences that had passed through without leaving obvious marks. He paused near a section of shelves he had not yet examined in detail. The books here were thinner, more uniform in size, their bindings less worn than those in other parts of the room. He ran his fingers lightly along their edges, feeling the subtle differences in texture. One of them shifted slightly under his touch. He stopped. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough to draw his attention. He grasped the book gently and pulled it forward. It came free, with little resistance. As he opened it, he immediately noticed something unusual. The pages inside were blank, not damaged, not faded, simply unwritten. He turned to the next page, and the next, all empty. At first, it seemed like an unfinished volume, perhaps prepared, but never completed. But as he continued flipping through the pages, he noticed faint impressions, marks pressed into the paper without ink, as though something had been written here and later removed, or perhaps written with a tool that left only pressure behind. He angled the book toward the light. The impressions became slightly more visible, though still difficult to interpret. Lines, shapes, fragments of letters that did not fully resolve into readable text. He closed the book halfway and paused. The message returned to his mind. You are not the first to hear it. Hear it, not read, not see. Hear. He opened the book again, this time more carefully, and held it closer, as though proximity might reveal something that distance concealed. At first, there was nothing. Then, a faint sound, so subtle that it might have been mistaken for the shifting of air. But it did not fade. It remained barely perceptible, like a whisper just beyond comprehension. The prince held the book still. The sound did not grow louder nor clearer. It existed at the edge of perception, requiring attention to maintain its presence. When his focus drifted even slightly, it seemed to disappear entirely. He adjusted his grip, bringing the book closer to his ear. The whisper-like sound persisted. Not a voice, not exactly, but something structured, not random. A pattern, perhaps. He closed his eyes briefly, concentrating. The sound did not resolve into words, but its rhythm suggested intention. Pauses, repetitions, variations, too consistent to be accidental. He opened his eyes again slowly. The realization came gradually. Some of the knowledge in this library was not meant to be read in the usual way. It was meant to be perceived differently. He lowered the book carefully, his expression unchanged, though his awareness had shifted once again. The library was not just a collection of written ideas. It was a system, one that required more than sight. He replaced the blank volume on the shelf, though not exactly where it had been. The slight change in position felt intentional, though he could not fully explain why. Perhaps he thought it would be noticed. Perhaps that was the point. He stepped back and turned, scanning the room with renewed attention. If one book functioned this way, others might as well. And if someone else had left him a message acknowledging his presence, then it was possible that these mechanisms were not merely remnants of the past, but active elements of an ongoing exchange. The thought did not feel alarming. It felt structured, as though he had entered a system already in use, one that did not require direct interaction to function. He moved toward the center of the library, where the light from the high window spread most evenly across the floor. Dust particles drifted slowly through the air, their movement unchanged, unaffected by the subtle complexities hidden within the shelves. From here, the room looked almost ordinary. Almost. He considered returning to the inner rooms, to the precise order of the hidden chamber, to the chair that had altered his perception in ways he still did not fully understand. But something held him here, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but a sense that the outer library still had more to reveal. He walked toward another section, this one darker, where the light reached only partially. The books here were older, their bindings more fragile, their arrangement less consistent. As he approached, he noticed something else, a pattern in the dust. Not footprints, not exactly, but disturbances, subtle shifts where the dust had been displaced, not in clear shapes, but in faint, irregular lines that suggested movement over time. Repeated movement, not recent enough to leave clear impressions, but not old enough to have fully settled. He crouched slightly, examining the floor more closely. The lines intersected in certain places, diverged in others, forming a network that did not immediately make sense. Paths, not obvious ones, but consistent. He traced one of the lines with his finger, following its direction toward a nearby shelf. It led to a specific section, stopping just beneath a cluster of books arranged at an angle. He stood and reached for one, then paused. Instead of selecting randomly, he allowed his hand to hover for a moment, as though waiting for some subtle indication. There was none, and yet he chose one. He pulled it from the shelf and opened it. Inside, the text appeared ordinary at first glance, written in a familiar style, consistent with other volumes he had already read. But as he turned the pages, he began to notice small irregularities. Certain words repeated more frequently than expected. Certain phrases appeared out of place, as though inserted deliberately. He read one sentence again, then another, and slowly the pattern emerged. The repeated words, when taken together, formed a sequence, not in order of appearance, but when selected carefully. He began to extract them mentally, isolating each occurrence. The process was slow, requiring attention and patience, but eventually the sequence formed a message, not written directly, but embedded, hidden within the text. He closed the book halfway, his mind holding the fragments together. The message was incomplete, but it was enough to suggest intention, enough to confirm that the library was not merely a passive space. It was active, layered, communicative, and designed to be understood only by those willing to look beyond the obvious. The prince exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of recognition. Each discovery did not simplify the system. It deepened it. He returned the book to its place, aligning it carefully with the others. Then he stepped back once more, allowing his gaze to move across the room. The silence remained, but now it felt less like absence and more like structure, a framework within which something continued to unfold. And as he stood there, surrounded by shelves that no longer seemed random, by texts that no longer seemed static, he understood something with increasing clarity. This was not just a library. It was a conversation, one that did not rely on voices, one that did not require presence, and one that had been continuing long before he arrived. The prince adjusted his notes slightly, ensuring the parchment with the message remained secure. Then, without haste, he turned toward the deeper sections of the library once more, not searching, not following, but continuing, because whatever this place truly was, it was not waiting for him to find it. It was waiting for him to understand how to move within it. The prince moved deeper into the library, his steps quieter now, not because he feared being heard, but because the act of moving softly seemed to align better with the nature of the place itself. Each shelf he passed no longer felt like an object to inspect, but like a part of a larger arrangement that extended beyond his immediate understanding. The air felt steady, undisturbed, as though it had adapted to the slow rhythm of careful observation. He noticed how even his own presence did not disrupt the balance of the room, but rather settled into it. It was as if the library accepted movement, but only when it was measured. He paused near a tall, narrow shelf that leaned slightly toward the wall, its upper edge nearly touching the stone behind it. The books here were tightly packed, leaving little space between them, as though they had been compressed over time. Unlike other sections, there was no dust resting on their surfaces, suggesting they had been handled more recently than most. He reached out, not to pull one free, but to feel the pressure between them. The resistance was subtle, but present, as though something behind the arrangement held them in place. Slowly, he began to remove the books one by one, placing them gently on the floor beside him in the same order he found them. There was no urgency in his movements, only a quiet intention to see what lay beyond. As the row thinned, the back of the shelf became visible, revealing a narrow wooden panel set into the structure. It did not stand out at first, but once exposed, its edges became clear. The panel was not part of the original design. It had been added, fitted carefully into the space. He examined the panel closely, running his fingers along its edges, searching for any sign of how it might be opened. There was no handle, no visible seam large enough to grip. But near the bottom corner, he felt a slight indentation, worn just enough to suggest repeated use. He pressed against it gently. At first, nothing happened, but then the panel shifted inward slightly, loosening from its position. With a careful motion, he pulled the panel aside, revealing a shallow compartment hidden within the shelf. Inside, there were no books, no instruments, no complex arrangements, only a single folded sheet of parchment resting at the center. It was placed with precision, aligned perfectly with the edges of the compartment. The simplicity of it stood in contrast to everything else he had seen so far. He reached in and lifted the parchment, unfolding it slowly to avoid damaging its edges. The writing on it was clear, deliberate, and unmistakably recent, much like the note he had found earlier. The message was longer this time, though still concise. It did not explain the library, nor did it describe its purpose directly. Instead, it offered a statement that felt more like guidance than instruction. Patterns do not reveal themselves to those who search for them directly. They emerge when attention shifts away from expectation. The prince read the line several times, letting its meaning settle rather than trying to force an interpretation. It did not contradict anything he had already observed, but it added a layer of intention to his experience. His earlier discoveries, hidden messages, subtle sounds, indirect structures, suddenly felt less accidental and more aligned with a method he had not consciously followed. He folded the parchment carefully and placed it alongside the other note in his collection, ensuring it remained undamaged. Then he returned his attention to the compartment. There was nothing else inside, no additional clues or objects, only the empty space where the parchment had rested. He replaced the panel, pressing it back into position until it aligned seamlessly with the shelf once more. After returning the books to their original order, he stepped back and observed the shelf again. There was no visible sign that anything had been disturbed. The arrangement appeared exactly as it had before, as though the hidden compartment had never been opened. This, too, felt intentional. The library did not advertise its secrets. It preserved them beneath layers of normalcy. He began to walk again, this time allowing his gaze to soften rather than focus sharply on any one object. The message lingered in his thoughts, attention shifting away from expectation. He realized that many of his earlier discoveries had not come from direct searching, but from moments of pause, from allowing his awareness to expand rather than narrow. He slowed his pace even further, letting his eyes move naturally across the room without forcing them to settle. At first, nothing seemed different. The shelves remained as they were, the books unchanged, the dust drifting slowly through the light. But gradually, subtle distinctions began to appear, small inconsistencies that had previously blended into the background. A book placed slightly higher than the rest, a gap that did not align with the spacing of the shelves, a faint mark on the wall that did not match the surrounding stone. None of these details stood out on their own, but together they formed a pattern, not a clear one, but a suggestion of structure beneath the surface. He moved toward one of these irregularities, a narrow gap between two shelves that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Instead of reaching into it immediately, he paused, observing it from different angles. The gap did not reveal anything obvious, but its presence felt intentional, as though it marked a boundary rather than a flaw. He knelt slightly, bringing his perspective closer to the level of the shelf, and noticed something he had not seen before. Inside the gap, just beyond the reach of direct light, there was a faint reflection, not from metal or glass, but from something smoother than the surrounding wood. It shifted slightly as he adjusted his position, confirming that it was not an illusion. Carefully, he reached into the gap, his fingers moving slowly to avoid disturbing anything unnecessarily. He felt the edge of a thin object, flat and smooth, resting against the inner surface. With a gentle motion, he pulled it free. It was not a book, but a narrow strip of polished material, no larger than his hand. He held it up to the light. The surface reflected the room in a distorted way, bending the shapes of the shelves and books into unfamiliar forms. It was not entirely reflective, but not entirely opaque either. When he tilted it slightly, the reflection shifted, revealing angles that did not match his direct line of sight. He turned it slowly, experimenting with the way it altered his perception of the space. And then, as the angle aligned just right, he noticed something unexpected. In the reflection, between two shelves that appeared ordinary when viewed directly, there was a faint outline, an additional shape that did not exist in his normal view. He lowered the strip and looked directly at the space. Nothing. He raised it again, adjusting the angle. The outline returned, a hidden form, visible only through distortion. The prince remained still, holding the strip in place, allowing the reflected image to stabilize. The shape did not move, did not change, but it existed clearly within the altered perspective. It suggested another layer of the library, one that could not be seen without shifting the way one looked at it. He exhaled slowly, not out of surprise, but out of recognition. The message had been correct. Patterns did not reveal themselves through direct searching. They required a different kind of attention. He lowered the strip slightly, then raised it again, confirming what he had seen. The hidden outline remained consistent, positioned exactly where the reflection indicated. Whatever it was not an illusion. It was part of the structure, concealed not by distance or obstruction, but by perception itself. The prince held the strip carefully, his gaze steady, his mind adjusting once more to the expanding complexity of the library. Each discovery did not replace the previous one. It built upon it, adding layers that required patience to understand. The space around him felt larger now, not physically, but in possibility. And as he stood there, the distorted reflection revealing what direct sight could not, he understood that the library was not meant to be fully uncovered in a single path. It unfolded gradually, responding not to force, but to awareness. He adjusted his grip on the strip and took a slow step toward the area where the hidden outline appeared. The reflection shifted with him, maintaining its alignment, guiding his movement without directing it. The library remained silent, but its structure spoke in subtler ways. And somewhere within that silence, beyond the reach of ordinary perception, the next layer of the prince's discovery waited, not concealed, but simply unseen, until the moment he learned how to look at it. The prince advanced slowly, keeping the narrow, reflective strip steady in his hand, as though it were not merely an object, but a guide that required careful attention. Each step he took caused the reflected image to shift slightly, yet the faint hidden outline remained anchored within it, unmoving and consistent. The shelves around him appeared unchanged when viewed directly, yet through the distorted surface, their arrangement suggested something layered beneath the obvious. He adjusted his pace, to match the stability of the reflection. Understanding that haste would only blur what he had begun to perceive. The library seemed to reward patience, not action. As he drew closer to the space indicated by the reflection, he noticed that the air felt subtly different, not colder or warmer, but more still than the surrounding areas. The dust drifting through the light appeared thinner here, as though the movement of air had been reduced or redirected in some way. He paused just before the shelves aligned with the hidden outline and raised the strip again, refining the angle until the shape became clearer. It was not a solid object, but a boundary, an edge that separated one space from another. Yet, no such boundary existed when he looked directly. He extended his free hand toward the shelf, placing his fingers lightly against the wood while keeping the reflective strip raised. The sensation beneath his touch felt normal at first, the grain of the wood unchanged, the structure solid. But as he shifted his hand slightly, aligning it with the position indicated by the reflection, he felt a difference. The surface gave way, not entirely, but just enough to suggest that it was not as fixed as it appeared. He pressed gently, and the resistance softened further. The section of the shelf moved inward with a quiet, almost reluctant motion, revealing a narrow opening that had been perfectly concealed from direct view. Without the reflective strip, it would have remained invisible, blending seamlessly with the surrounding structure. He lowered the strip slightly, confirming that the opening disappeared when viewed normally, then raised it again to bring the hidden passage back into clarity. The realization settled calmly within him. The library did not hide its spaces behind locks or barriers, but behind perception itself. He stepped closer to the opening, angling his body to pass through while keeping the strip in hand. The passage beyond was dim, its walls smooth and unmarked, extending deeper than the light from the outer room could reach. He hesitated only briefly, not out of fear, but to observe the transition. Moving from one layer of the library to another had begun to feel less like entering a new space and more like shifting into a different understanding of the same one. Inside the passage, the air felt denser, quieter in a way that absorbed even the faintest sound. His footsteps made almost no noise, and his breathing seemed to settle naturally into the stillness. The reflective strip, though no longer necessary for navigation within the confined corridor, remained in his hand, its surface catching the faintest traces of light. He noticed that even here, the strip altered what little he could see, revealing subtle contours in the walls that were otherwise indistinct. After several steps, the passage opened into another chamber, though this one differed from the others he had encountered. It was neither chaotic like the outer library, nor precisely ordered like the inner room of instruments. Instead, it existed somewhere between the two, its arrangement deliberate, but not rigid, its contents varied, but not scattered. Shelves lined the walls, though they were spaced more widely apart, leaving open areas that gave the room a sense of quiet balance. At the center of the chamber stood a low table, its surface bare, except for a single object resting upon it. The prince approached slowly, his attention drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the familiarity of the arrangement. This was not the first time he had encountered a solitary object placed with intention. The simplicity of it suggested importance, not through complexity, but through focus. He reached the table and looked down at the object that intersected, diverged, and rejoined in a continuous network. The Prince Remit was another reflective surface, larger than the strip he carried, but similar in nature. Its shape was circular, its edges smooth, its surface polished to a clarity that surpassed the narrow piece he held. Yet, unlike the strip, this surface did not distort the reflection in obvious ways. Instead, it presented a clearer image, the one that felt subtly altered, as though it revealed more than it showed. He lifted it carefully, holding it at eye level. The room appeared within it, but not exactly as it was. The shelves seemed slightly repositioned, their alignment shifted in ways that did not match his direct view. The spaces between them appeared deeper, extending further than the physical room allowed. And within those spaces, faint shapes moved not independently, but as extensions of the structure itself. He lowered the circular surface slightly, then raised it again, adjusting his angle to confirm what he was seeing. The altered perspective remained consistent, suggesting that the reflection was not random, but intentional. It revealed a version of the room that existed alongside the visible one, overlapping yet inaccessible through ordinary sight. The prince remained still, allowing the image to settle in his mind. The library, he realized, was not composed of separate hidden rooms, but of layers that coexisted within the same space. Each layer required a different way of seeing, a different method of engagement. The reflective surfaces were not tools for discovery alone, but for translation, converting one form of perception into another. He placed the circular surface back on the table, though not exactly where it had been, mirroring the subtle adjustment he had made earlier with the blank book. The act felt deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement that his presence here was not entirely passive. He was not only uncovering the system, he was becoming part of its ongoing arrangement. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber once more, this time without relying solely on direct sight. His awareness shifted between what he could see and what he could infer, between the physical arrangement and the patterns suggested by reflection. The room responded not with movement, but with coherence, its structure becoming more understandable as his perception adapted. Near one of the far shelves, he noticed a slight misalignment, a space that appeared ordinary at first glance, but carried the same subtle tension he had come to recognize. He approached it without haste, raising the reflective strip again to confirm his observation. The distortion revealed a faint extension beyond the shelf, a continuation that did not exist in the visible structure. He lowered the strip and reached out, his hand moving to the exact point where the extension had appeared. The surface felt solid at first, but as before, It yielded slightly under pressure, revealing another concealed opening. This one was smaller, narrower, leading not into a full chamber, but into a confined alcove. Inside, there were no shelves, no tables, no instruments, only a series of markings on the wall. The prince stepped closer, examining them carefully. They were not words, nor symbols in the usual sense, but patterns, repeating shapes arranged in sequences that suggested rhythm rather than meaning. He traced one with his finger, feeling the shallow indentation in the stone. The pattern did not resolve into anything familiar, yet it carried a sense of structure, as though it represented something beyond direct interpretation. He stepped back slightly, considering the markings. Then, almost instinctively, he raised the reflective strip once more and angled it toward the wall. The effect was immediate. The patterns shifted, not physically, but in the reflection, aligning into forms that began to resemble something more coherent. Lines connected, shapes completed themselves, and what had seemed abstract began to suggest direction, movement, perhaps even instruction. He adjusted the angle again, refining the alignment until the reflected pattern stabilized. It was not a map in the traditional sense, but it conveyed spatial relationships, connections between points, pathways that extended beyond the immediate room. The library, it seemed, was not confined to the spaces he had already explored. It extended further in ways that required both observation and interpretation to navigate. The prince lowered the strip slowly, the reflected pattern dissolving back into its original abstract form. He stood there for a moment, absorbing what he had seen. Each layer of the library did not replace the previous one. It expanded it, revealing new dimensions that had always existed, waiting to be perceived. The system was not linear, not meant to be followed step by step, but experienced through shifting awareness. He stepped out of the alcove and returned to the center of the chamber, his movements steady, his thoughts aligned with the quiet complexity surrounding him. The reflective surfaces, the hidden passages, the embedded patterns, they all pointed toward a single understanding. This place was not meant to be mastered. It was meant to be engaged with. And as he stood there, the silence of the chamber no longer felt like an absence of sound, but like a presence of structure, an environment that did not speak, yet communicated through every detail. The prince looked once more at the circular reflective surface on the table, then at the narrow strip in his hand. Tools not for uncovering secrets, but for learning how to see. And somewhere beyond the layers, he had already begun to understand. The next part of the library waited, not hidden, not locked, but simply existing in a way that required him to continue adapting. He took a slow breath, then turned toward the deeper edge of the chamber, and without hesitation, he continued forward. The prince moved beyond the chamber with a steadier awareness, no longer questioning whether the path ahead existed, but instead adjusting how he approached it. The deeper edge of the room did not present a clear doorway or passage, yet the subtle shifts in alignment suggested continuation. He no longer relied solely on sight, nor entirely on the reflective tools, but on a balance between the two. The environment felt less like a maze and more like a system responding to perception. Each step forward felt less like discovery and more like participation in an ongoing design. The walls ahead appeared solid, yet their stillness carried a quiet suggestion of depth beyond what could be seen directly. He slowed, not out of hesitation, but to allow his awareness to widen rather than narrow. The instinct to search directly had begun to fade, replaced by a more passive attentiveness. His gaze softened, moving across surfaces without forcing meaning from them. It was in this state that the library had revealed itself most clearly before, and he trusted that pattern now. A faint irregularity appeared not in shape, but in absence. A section of wall where the texture felt less defined, where the subtle imperfections of stone seemed to diminish rather than accumulate. It was not obvious, and it would have been easy to overlook entirely. But now, it stood out precisely because it did not draw attention to itself. He approached it slowly, allowing the difference to become more apparent as he drew closer. He raised the reflective strip again, though only slightly, not relying on it completely, but using it as a secondary confirmation. The distorted surface revealed a faint extension beyond the wall, not a passage in the traditional sense, but a continuation of space that existed just outside normal perception. It was not a doorway, but a transition point, one that required alignment rather than force. He reached forward, placing his hand against the surface where the reflection suggested depth. At first, it felt unchanged, the stone cool and solid beneath his fingers. But as he adjusted his position, aligning his movement with the subtle angle revealed by the reflection, the resistance softened. The wall did not open, it receded, as though his perception had shifted just enough to allow passage. He stepped forward, not through an opening, but into a space that seemed to form around him as he moved. The transition was smooth, without any clear boundary marking where one area ended and another began. The chamber behind him faded from view, not because it disappeared, but because his perspective no longer aligned with it. The new space did not replace the old. It simply existed beyond it. The environment he entered was different from any he had seen so far. It was not defined by shelves or objects, nor by walls arranged to contain knowledge. Instead, it felt open, though not expansive in the usual sense. The space seemed to extend in all directions, yet remain contained within a quiet, controlled structure. There were no visible sources of light, yet everything was softly illuminated. He paused, allowing his senses to adjust. The silence here was deeper than before, not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of interruption. It did not echo, did not shift, did not respond. It simply existed, complete and undisturbed. Even his own presence did not seem to alter it. For a moment, he felt as though he had stepped outside the layers of the library entirely into something more foundational. Then, gradually, details began to emerge. Not objects, but patterns. Faint lines extended across the space, barely visible at first, like threads woven into the air itself. They did not form solid structures, but suggested connections, pathsing still. Observing them without attempting to interpret too quickly, the lines shifted subtly as he moved his head, not because they were changing, but because his perception of them depended on his position. They were not fixed in a single orientation. They existed relationally, revealing themselves differently depending on how they were observed. He raised the reflective strip again, but this time it did not distort the lines, it clarified them. The network became more defined through the reflection, each connection appearing sharper, more intentional. It was not random. It was structured, though not in a way that followed conventional patterns. The lines did not form shapes that could be easily named or categorized. Instead, they suggested relationships, connections between points that extended beyond immediate visibility. He lowered the strip slightly, then raised it again, confirming that the effect remained consistent. The tool was not revealing something hidden in the usual sense. It was translating a layer of the space into something his mind could begin to process. Without it, the patterns remained too subtle to fully grasp. With it, they became clearer, though still not entirely understood. The prince took a slow step forward. The lines responded not by moving, but by shifting in clarity. Certain connections became more visible, while others faded slightly, as though his position influenced which parts of the network he could perceive most strongly. It was not reactive, but relational. The system did not change, his interaction with it did. He continued forward, carefully adjusting his angle of view, allowing the patterns to guide his movement without dictating it. Each step revealed a slightly different configuration, a new arrangement of connections that overlapped with the previous ones. It was not a single path, but many, all existing simultaneously. At the center of this network, if such a center could be said to exist, there was a convergence, a point where multiple lines intersected more densely than elsewhere. It did not stand out dramatically, but its structure was more complex, more layered. The prince moved toward it, guided not by instinct alone, but by the increasing coherence of the pattern. As he approached, the lines grew clearer, their intersections more defined, and then something else appeared. Not a line, not a pattern, but a form. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding structure, but gradually becoming more apparent. It was not solid, not fully present, but it held a shape that suggested intention. A presence, though not in the usual sense of the word. The prince stopped. The form did not move, yet it was not entirely still. It existed within the network, aligned with it, as though it were part of the structure rather than separate from it. Its Its edges were indistinct, blending into the lines that surrounded it. Yet its position remained constant. He raised the reflective strip again. Through it, the form became clearer, not detailed, not fully defined, but unmistakably intentional. A figure, not physical, not entirely visible, but present. The prince did not react with alarm. Instead, he observed. The figure did not approach, did not retreat. It remained where it was, integrated into the network of lines, as though it had always been there. It did not acknowledge him directly, yet its presence altered the space in a way that could not be ignored. For a moment, neither moved. The silence between them was not empty. It was structured, like everything else in this place. The prince lowered the strip slightly, then raised it again, confirming that the figure remained visible only through the altered perception. Without the tool, it faded into the surrounding patterns, indistinguishable from them. He took a slow step closer. The lines shifted in clarity once more, the network adjusting in relation to his position. The figure remained unchanged, and yet, as he moved, something subtle occurred. A faint shift, not in the figure itself, but in the connections surrounding it. The lines closest to it grew more defined, as though responding to proximity, or perhaps to attention. The prince stopped again, allowing the moment to settle. This was not an encounter in the traditional sense. There were no words, no gestures, no direct exchange, and yet something was happening. A recognition, perhaps, not of identity, but of presence. He held the reflective strip steady, his gaze fixed on the faint form within the network, and as the patterns around it continued to clarify, he began to understand something that had not been fully apparent before. The library was not only a system of knowledge, it was a system of participants, not all of them visible, not all of them present in the same way, but connected through layers that extended beyond the physical. The prince remained still, his awareness fully engaged, his understanding expanding not through explanation, but through observation. And in that quiet convergence, where lines met and perception deepened, the next stage of his journey began, not with a question, but with a presence that did not need to speak to be understood. The prince did not step back from the faint figure, nor did he move closer immediately, choosing instead to remain within the quiet balance that had formed between them. The network of lines around the figure continued to shift in clarity, not in position, as though responding to the steadiness of his attention. He realized that movement alone was not the only way to engage with this space. Stillness, when deliberate, revealed as much as action. The reflective strip in his hand remained angled just enough to hold the figure within view. And in that careful alignment, the moment extended without urgency. Figure itself did not possess detail in the way physical forms do, yet it carried a structure that suggested presence beyond abstraction. Its outline was neither fixed nor fluid, existing somewhere between the two, as though it adapted to the limits of perception. The prince observed this without trying to define it too quickly. He had learned that forcing clarity often dissolved it. Instead, he allowed the form to remain partially unresolved, trusting that its meaning would emerge through continued attention. The silence between them remained intact, yet it no longer felt empty. As he held his position, a subtle change began to occur within the network of lines. The connections nearest the figure grew more pronounced, their intersections forming clearer relationships that extended outward toward the prince's position. It was not a movement, but an alignment, as though the space itself was adjusting to include him within its structure. He did not interpret this as invitation or warning. It simply was, and his role, for now, was to observe without interrupting the balance. He adjusted the reflective strip slightly, refining the angle to maintain clarity without overexposure. The figure remained stable, but the surrounding lines revealed new layers, secondary connections that had not been visible before. These lines extended beyond the immediate convergence, reaching into areas of the space that remained only partially defined. It suggested that the figure was not isolated, but part of a larger configuration that extended far beyond what he could currently perceive. The prince took a slow step forward. The response was immediate, though subtle. The lines between him and the figure became more distinct, forming a pathway that was not physical, but perceptual. It did not guide his feet, but his awareness. He paused again, recognizing that each movement altered the structure of what he could see. The space was not static. It revealed itself in relation to his engagement. And now, he was closer, not in distance alone, but in alignment. He lowered the reflective strip for a moment. Figure dissolved into the surrounding network, no longer distinguishable from the lines themselves. Only the faint suggestion of its presence remained, like an imprint left behind after something has moved, even when it has not. He raised the strip again, and the figure returned, unchanged in position, yet now more familiar in its form. This repetition confirmed what he had begun to understand. The figure was not appearing and disappearing. It was always there. Only his perception shifted. He remained still once more, allowing the clarity to stabilize. Then, gradually, he noticed something new. Within the structure of the figure itself, there were patterns, finer lines, that mirrored the larger network, though on a smaller scale. They were not immediately visible, but as he focused, they began to emerge, forming internal connections that reflected the same complexity as the space around it. The figure was not separate from the network. It was a concentrated expression of it. The realization did not arrive as a sudden insight, but as a quiet recognition. This presence was not an observer within the system. It was part of the system itself. And if that was true, then the prince's own presence might not be as separate as he had assumed. He held the reflective strip steady, his gaze fixed on the faint form within the network, and as the patterns around it continued to clarify, he began to understand something that had not been fully apparent before. The library was not only a system of knowledge, it was a system of participants, not all of them visible, not all of them present in the same way, but connected through layers that extended beyond the physical. The prince remained still, his awareness fully engaged, his understanding expanding not through explanation, but through observation. And in that quiet convergence, where lines met and perception deepened, the next stage of his journey began, not with a question, but with a presence that did not need to speak to be understood. The prince did not step back from the faint figure, nor did he move closer immediately, choosing instead to remain within the quiet balance that had formed between them. The network of lines around the figure continued to shift in clarity, not in position, as though responding to the steadiness of his attention. He realized that movement alone was not the only way to engage with this space. Stillness, when deliberate, revealed as much as action. The reflective strip in his hand remained angled just enough to hold the figure within view. And in that careful alignment, the moment extended without urgency. Figure itself did not possess detail in the way physical forms do, yet it carried a structure that suggested presence beyond abstraction. Its outline was neither fixed nor fluid, existing somewhere between the two, as though it adapted to the limits of perception. The prince observed this without trying to define it too quickly. He had learned that forcing clarity often dissolved it. Instead, he allowed the form to remain partially unresolved, trusting that its meaning would emerge through continued attention. The silence between them remained intact, yet it no longer felt empty. As he held his position, a subtle change began to occur within the network of lines. The connections nearest the figure grew more pronounced, their intersections forming clearer relationships that extended outward toward the prince's position. It was not a movement, but an alignment, as though the space itself was adjusting to include him within its structure. He did not interpret this as invitation or warning. It simply was, and his role, for now, was to observe without interrupting the balance. He adjusted the reflective strip slightly, refining the angle to maintain clarity without overexposure. The figure remained stable, but the surrounding lines revealed new layers, secondary connections that had not been visible before. These lines extended beyond the immediate convergence, reaching into areas of the space that remained only partially defined. It suggested that the figure was not isolated, but part of a larger configuration that extended far beyond what he could currently perceive. The prince took a slow step forward. The response was immediate, though subtle. The lines between him and the figure became more distinct, forming a pathway that was not physical, but perceptual. It did not guide his feet, but his awareness. He paused again, recognizing that each movement altered the structure of what he could see. The space was not static. It revealed itself in relation to his engagement. And now, he was closer, not in distance alone, but in alignment. He lowered the reflective strip for a moment. Figure dissolved into the surrounding network, no longer distinguishable from the lines themselves. Only the faint suggestion of its presence remained, like an imprint left behind after something has moved, even when it has not. He raised the strip again, and the figure returned, unchanged in position, yet now more familiar in its form. This repetition confirmed what he had begun to understand. The figure was not appearing and disappearing. It was always there. Only his perception shifted. He remained still once more, allowing the clarity to stabilize. Then, gradually, he noticed something new. Within the structure of the figure itself, there were patterns, finer lines, that mirrored the larger network, though on a smaller scale. They were not immediately visible, but as he focused, they began to emerge, forming internal connections that reflected the same complexity as the space around it. The figure was not separate from the network. It was a concentrated expression of it. The realization did not arrive as a sudden insight, but as a quiet recognition. This presence was not an observer within the system. It was part of the system itself. And if that was true, then the prince's own presence might not be as separate as he had assumed. He lowered the strip slightly, then raised it again, testing whether his own reflection appeared within it. The surface did not behave like a mirror in the traditional sense. It did not show his face, nor his form, but something else, a faint distortion in the lines where he stood, a subtle alteration in the network that corresponded to his position. He could not see himself directly, but he could see his effect. He remained still, watching the way the lines adjusted around him. They did not resist. They did not reject. They adapted. This, too, felt important. The prince took another step forward, slower this time, allowing the network to settle before moving again. The pathway of clarity between him and the figure strengthened, not by becoming brighter, but by becoming more consistent. Fewer distortions, fewer shifts, a stable alignment. He stopped when the distance felt sufficient, not close enough to disrupt, not far enough to disengage. Balanced, the figure remained where it was, unchanged in form, yet more present now than before. The surrounding lines had become clearer, their intersections forming a structure that felt less abstract and more intentional. It was still not something that could be easily described, but it no longer felt incomprehensible. He held the reflective strip steady, then slowly lowered it once more. This time, he did not raise it immediately. He allowed himself to remain within the unaltered perception, to see what remained when the tool was removed. The network softened, the lines fading back into near invisibility. The figure disappeared again, but something else remained, a sense of position, not visual, not defined, but present. He could not see the figure without the strip, but he could still feel where it was, as though his awareness had adapted enough to retain a trace of its location. It was not precise, but it was not random either. It suggested that perception, once adjusted, did not fully return to its previous state. He raised the strip again. the figure reappeared, exactly where he had sensed it. The confirmation settled quietly within him. He was beginning to align with the system. Not fully, not completely, but enough to perceive, without relying entirely on the tools. He lowered the strip once more, testing the effect again. The figure vanished from sight, but its presence remained faintly within his awareness. He did not raise the strip this time. Instead, he stood still, focusing on that subtle sense of position, allowing it to stabilize without visual reinforcement. The silence of the space deepened, not in absence, but in clarity. The prince remained there, eyes open yet not searching, aware of both what he could see and what he could not. The network, though no longer visible in detail, still influenced his perception, guiding his awareness in ways that did not require direct observation. After a long moment, he took a step, not toward the figure, but slightly to the side. The sense of position shifted. He adjusted again, returning to where it felt most aligned. The position stabilized. This was not sight. It was something else, a different form of perception. He stood there, allowing this new awareness to settle fully. Then slowly, he raised the reflective strip one final time. The figure appeared again, exactly where he expected it to be, unchanged, present, integrated. The prince lowered the strip and let it rest at his side. He no longer needed to hold it constantly in place. The understanding remained. The library, in all its layers, was not revealing itself all at once. It was teaching him how to perceive it. And now, standing within that quiet network, aware of a presence he could both see and sense, he understood that the next stage would not come from finding something new, but from becoming capable of seeing what had already been there all along. And in that realization, the distance between observer and structure began to feel less defined, as though the boundary itself was slowly dissolving. The prince stood in the same position for a long moment after lowering the reflective strip, allowing the absence of its visual clarity to settle into his perception. The figure was no longer visible in a direct sense, yet its position remained within his awareness, like a silent anchor within a shifting field of understanding. He did not attempt to force its reappearance immediately, because he had begun to recognize that urgency disrupted the very structure he was trying to perceive. Instead, he adjusted his breathing and allowed the silence to stabilize around him. The space responded not with movement, but with coherence. Slowly, he began to understand that what he had been calling seeing was only one layer of engagement. Without the strip, the network of lines faded from view, but they did not disappear entirely from his awareness. They lingered as relationships rather than images, as positional sense rather than visual confirmation. He realized that the library was not asking him to rely less on tools, but to integrate perception across multiple forms. The strip revealed structure, but his mind was beginning to retain it even in its absence. This transition felt subtle, yet fundamental. He took a careful step forward, not toward a visible target, but toward the remembered position of the figure. The movement did not disrupt the sense of alignment he had been holding. Instead, it refined it. As he advanced, the faint awareness of structure adjusted itself, maintaining consistency without requiring direct observation. It was as if the space acknowledged his intention rather than his sight. He stopped again when the balance felt stable, not because of what he saw, but because of what he no longer needed to see. In that stillness, a new realization formed. The figure was not a fixed entity located in space, but a convergence point within a system of perception. It existed as long as he was aligned with the network in a particular way. When he shifted perception, it shifted form. This meant that what he was engaging with was not static knowledge, but responsive structure. The library did not merely contain information, it adapted to the mode of understanding applied to it. This idea did not feel theoretical, it felt immediate. He slowly raised the reflective strip again, but this time with less dependence on it. The figure reappeared, yet he did not focus on it directly. Instead, he observed the surrounding network first. The lines were more stable than before, less fragmented in appearance. Their intersections formed clearer pathways that extended beyond the immediate field of view. The figure, when he finally allowed his attention to settle on it, seemed less like an isolated presence and more like a node within a larger configuration. Prince lowered the strip again, testing the persistence of what he had just observed. The figure faded, but the structure remained partially accessible in his awareness. It no longer vanished completely when visual confirmation was removed. This confirmed a shift in his perception that had been developing gradually since entering this space. He was no longer dependent solely on external tools to maintain structural understanding. The tools now functioned as reinforcement rather than revelation. He turned slightly to his left, not because the figure demanded it, but because the internal sense of alignment suggested continuation in that direction. As he moved, the awareness of structure adjusted smoothly, revealing secondary pathways within the network. These were not separate from the main convergence, but extensions of it, branching subtly into areas that had not yet been fully engaged. The library was not presenting a single truth, but a layered continuity of relationships. He stopped near one of these secondary alignments. Without raising the strip, he attempted to focus on the subtle sense of structure alone. At first, it was faint, unstable, shifting slightly as his attention wavered. But as he maintained focus, the sense of position became clearer again. It was not visual, yet it carried specificity. He could distinguish direction, density, and proximity without requiring direct sight. This ability was still incomplete, but undeniably developing. When he raised the strip again, the refinement became visually confirmed. The network appeared denser along this secondary path, with intersections forming patterns that mirrored the main convergence, but on a smaller scale. The repetition suggested a fractal-like structure, where where each section reflected the whole in reduced form. The figure he had first encountered was not unique. It was representative. There were likely others, distributed across the system in similar patterns of convergence. The prince lowered the strip slowly, allowing this realization to settle without interruption. If multiple such figures existed, then the library was not centered around a single presence or node, but around a distributed system of awareness. Each node might represent a different aspect of engagement, or perhaps different stages of perception itself. The implication was not fully formed in his mind, but it was beginning to take shape. He moved again, this time following the secondary alignment more deliberately. Each step refined his awareness further, reducing the gap between perception and structure. The environment did not resist his movement, it adapted to it. The lines, whether visible or sensed, maintained coherence relative to his position. It was as if the system was designed not to be decoded from a distance, but entered gradually through participation. At a certain point, he noticed a shift. The sense of alignment became stronger, more concentrated. He stopped immediately, recognizing that this was similar to the earlier convergence point, but not identical. It was denser, more localized. When he raised the strip, the structure confirmed this difference. The network here was not simply intersecting. It was layering multiple intersections over one another, creating depth within depth. Within this intensified convergence, something faintly resembled the figure again. Not identical to the first, but structurally similar. It did not fully resolve into form unless he adjusted the angle of perception precisely. When he did, the figure appeared briefly, then partially dissolved again as he shifted focus. It was unstable, not because it was incomplete, but because it required precise alignment to be perceived consistently. He lowered the strip and focused entirely on internal awareness. The sense of position confirmed that something remained here, even without visual support. This reinforced his understanding that the library operated across multiple perceptual layers simultaneously. The strip revealed structure, but awareness maintained it. Together, they formed a composite understanding. The prince remained still for several moments, allowing this dual perception to stabilize. He was no longer simply observing the library. He was learning how to exist within its system of layered perception. Each adjustment in attention altered what became visible, not by changing reality, but by shifting access to it. He raised the strip once more, confirming the stability of the secondary convergence. The figure appeared again, clearer this time, though still dependent on alignment. He did not approach it immediately. Instead, he observed how it responded to his presence. The surrounding lines adjusted subtly, reinforcing the convergence as he maintained focus. It was not reactive in a conscious sense, but structurally responsive. Then slowly, he lowered the strip again and allowed himself to remain within unassisted perception. The figure faded, but not completely from awareness. It remained as a structured absence, a defined position within a field he could no longer fully see, but could still navigate. He understood now that progression within this library was not about moving from one room to another, but about shifting between modes of perception while remaining within the same underlying structure. Each layer he accessed did not replace the previous one. It expanded it. And as he stood there, within the quiet convergence of unseen lines and remembered positions, the prince realized that the library was not only teaching him how to find hidden things, it was teaching him how to remain within them without losing coherence. And somewhere deeper within that realization, another layer of the system was already waiting silent, structured, and prepared for the next shift in his awareness. The prince remained within the secondary convergence point longer than he had intended, not because he was uncertain, but because the stability of perception here required time to fully settle into awareness. The faint presence of the figure, even when not visually confirmed, continued to anchor his understanding of the surrounding structure. He no longer felt the need to constantly raise the reflective strip, as the internal sense of alignment had grown more reliable. Instead, he used the tool sparingly, as a way to confirm rather than discover. This shift marked a subtle but important transition in how he engaged with the library. He began to notice that the convergence did not remain entirely static when he stopped focusing on it. Even in unassisted perception, there were traces of continuity, subtle shifts in awareness that suggested the structure persisted beyond direct observation. It was not visible in the traditional sense, but it was not absent either. The prince found himself able to feel the boundaries of the convergence without needing to see them. This sensation was not physical, but relational, as though space itself had gained a kind of memory. Slowly, he turned within the space, testing how far this internal awareness extended. As he shifted his position, the sense of alignment adjusted smoothly, maintaining coherence without collapsing. This confirmed something he had begun to suspect earlier. The library did not require fixed positioning to maintain structure. Instead, it responded dynamically to the observer's orientation. The figure, the lines, the convergence points, all existed in a state of conditional visibility. They were stable only when engaged correctly. He raised the reflective strip once more, not to reveal something new, but to compare what he already sensed with what could be visually confirmed. The structure appeared consistent, yet the strip revealed additional layers that were not accessible through internal perception alone. Secondary intersections branched further than he had previously detected, extending the network into deeper regions of the space. These extensions were not random. They followed patterns that suggested repetition across multiple scales. The prince lowered the strip again, absorbing the implication without interruption. The library was not a single layered construct, but a recursive system, where each layer reflected variations of the same underlying design. The figure he had encountered earlier was not an endpoint. but a repeated motif within a broader structure. This meant that what he perceived as presence was likely distributed across many similar points, each requiring different alignment conditions to observe fully. He began to walk slowly along one of the faint internal pathways suggested by his awareness. Each step did not produce physical change in the environment, but it refined his perception of it. The convergence behind him remained stable, yet new intersections began to appear ahead, forming a subtle gradient of complexity. It was not a path in the traditional sense, but a directional increase in structural density. As he moved deeper, the sense of layered perception intensified. Without the strip, the structure was still partially accessible, but less defined. With it, the same space became densely articulated, revealing interwoven patterns that extended in multiple directions simultaneously. The prince began to understand that the tool did not simply reveal hidden things, it shifted the resolution of perception itself. He paused when he reached a point where the internal sense of alignment became unusually concentrated. This was different from the earlier convergence. It did not feel like a node, but rather a transition zone between multiple overlapping structures. When he raised the strip, the complexity became visually apparent. The network here did not converge into a single figure, but fragmented into several partial forms, each aligned with different angles of observation. The prince studied these overlapping forms carefully, adjusting the strip incrementally to observe how each variation resolved. One form appeared more stable when viewed from a slightly higher angle, while another became clearer when the strip was tilted downward. This suggested that no single perspective could fully capture the structure. Instead, understanding required movement between perspectives, not fixation on one. He lowered the strip and focused again on internal awareness. The overlapping forms did not disappear entirely. They remained as partial impressions within his perception. He could sense their positions, even without visual confirmation. This confirmed that his internal model of the space was becoming increasingly reliable, though still dependent on periodic reinforcement. He took a slow step forward into the transition zone. The effect was immediate but subtle. His awareness expanded slightly, not outwardly, but in terms of interpretive depth. The overlapping structures did not resolve into clarity, but they became easier to navigate mentally. It was as if the system was gradually training him to hold multiple interpretations at once, without collapsing them into a single conclusion. He raised the strip again to verify this shift. The overlapping forms were still present, but now they appeared less contradictory. Instead of competing for dominance, they coexisted, each representing a different valid alignment within the same space. This reinforced the idea that the library was not designed to present singular truths, but multiple, simultaneous perspectives. The prince lowered the strip and stood still, allowing this realization to settle fully. He understood now that the library was not simply revealing hidden knowledge, it was restructuring how knowledge itself was perceived. Each layer, each figure, each convergence was not an object to be found, but a condition to be entered. As he remained in place, he noticed a subtle change in the environment. The transition zone was no longer static. The overlapping structures began to shift slightly in relation to his sustained attention, not moving randomly, but adjusting their clarity based on where his focus rested. This confirmed that perception and structure were interdependent. He experimented carefully, shifting attention between different regions without moving physically. Each shift altered which layer became most prominent. One structure would sharpen while another receded, then reverse when his focus changed again. This dynamic confirmed that the library responded not only to presence, but to directed awareness. The prince began to see a pattern forming within this responsiveness. The system did not prioritize one structure over another. It allowed fluid transition between them based on engagement. This meant that mastery within the library was not about finding a final configuration, but about learning how to navigate between configurations without losing coherence. He lowered the strip completely and closed his eyes for a brief moment, relying entirely on internal perception. The structures remained faintly present, not as images, but as spatial relationships. He could still detect their positions, though with less precision. When he opened his eyes again and raised the strip, the clarity returned immediately, reinforcing the dual nature of perception he was now beginning to master. He took another step forward, moving deeper into the transition zone. The overlapping forms became more complex, but also more organized. Patterns within patterns began to emerge, suggesting that even the apparent complexity followed underlying rules. The prince realized that the library's structure was not chaotic. It was layered with intentional recursion. As he advanced further, he understood that the figure he had first encountered was not an isolated presence, but an entry point, a controlled convergence designed to initiate awareness of the system. Everything he had experienced so far, the hidden rooms, the reflective tools, the shifting perceptions, was part of a gradual adaptation process. The prince paused once more, recognizing that he was now no longer simply observing the library. He was actively participating in its structure of perception. Each movement, each adjustment of focus contributed to how the system revealed itself. And as he stood there, between overlapping layers of unseen design, he realized that the next stage would not be about discovering something new again. It would be about deciding how deeply he was willing to remain within what he had already begun to understand. The prince remained in the transition zone longer than before, not because he was uncertain of where to go next, but because the overlapping structures around him had reached a level of complexity that demanded sustained attention. Each layer of perception seemed to rest lightly upon the next, shifting only when his focus moved. He no longer felt like an external observer moving through a static environment. Instead, he felt as though he was participating in the stabilization of what he perceived. The library did not resist him, nor did it guide him in a fixed direction. It responded in proportion to his awareness. This realization did not create confusion, it created responsibility. He adjusted his position slightly, not to change location, but to test how perception would shift with minimal physical movement. The overlapping forms responded immediately, not by rearranging themselves, but by altering which aspects became most prominent. One layer gained clarity, while another receded into faint suggestion, as though the structure prioritized relevance based on attention. The prince noticed that no single configuration ever fully disappeared. Even when less visible, it remained present at the edges of awareness, waiting to be re-engaged. This persistent layering gave the space a sense of continuity that extended beyond immediate observation. He raised the reflective strip again, but this time with deliberate restraint, avoiding prolonged focus on any single alignment. The tool confirmed what he was beginning to sense internally. The structures were not separate entities, but interdependent expressions of a unified system. What appeared as multiple figures or pathways were actually variations of the same underlying pattern, adjusted according to perceptual angle. The strip did not reveal new information so much as it clarified relationships that already existed. The prince began to understand that the library's purpose was not to conceal truth, but to distribute it across levels of perception. As he lowered the strip, he allowed his awareness to remain open without anchoring it to visual confirmation. The transition zone responded by stabilizing into a more coherent field. The overlapping structures did not simplify, but they became more readable, as though his sustained attention had reduced unnecessary noise. He realized that clarity in this space was not achieved by removing complexity, but by aligning with it correctly. The system did not collapse into simplicity. It became intelligible through engagement. He took a slow step forward, and the effect was immediate. The structures ahead did not shift position, but their relational depth increased. What had previously appeared as overlapping forms now revealed hierarchical connections, some layers influencing others subtly, like underlying frameworks supporting visible patterns. The prince understood that movement within the library was not spatial alone. It was interpretive. Each step altered not the environment itself, but the depth at which it could be perceived. He paused again, focusing on a cluster of intersecting patterns that seemed denser than the surrounding structure. Without raising the strip, he attempted to follow the internal relationships between them. At first, they appeared fragmented, but with sustained attention, connections began to emerge. Lines of influence, directional shifts, and layered intersections gradually formed a coherent structure in his mind. It was incomplete, but but stable enough to navigate conceptually. This reinforced his understanding that perception itself had become the primary tool of exploration. When he finally raised the strip, the same cluster resolved into a clearer configuration. The overlapping forms were not random. They were organized in a way that suggested sequential layering, as though each level built upon the previous one. The prince observed that certain intersections acted as anchors, maintaining structural consistency across variations. These anchors did not change position, even when perception shifted. They served as fixed points within a flexible system. He lowered the strip again, allowing the internal model to persist without external support. The anchors remained present in his awareness, confirming that they were not dependent on visual reinforcement. This stability allowed him to move more confidently, not by following a fixed path, but by recognizing structural consistency across variations. He began to see movement within the library not as traversal, but as alignment with these stable points. He advanced deeper into the zone, and the complexity increased accordingly. However, instead of becoming more confusing, the structure began to organize itself more efficiently in response to his continued engagement. The overlapping forms now appeared less like competing layers and more like coordinated perspectives. Each layer contributed information that complemented the others, forming a multidimensional understanding of the same underlying system. The prince paused again when he noticed a subtle shift. One of the structural layers began to exhibit a pattern of repetition that differed from the others. It did not align perfectly with the anchors he had identified, yet it did not contradict them either. Instead, it appeared to operate on a parallel level, suggesting an alternative mode of organization within the same system. When he raised the strip, this layer became partially visible, revealing a secondary network that ran alongside the primary structure. Studied this secondary network carefully, adjusting his focus between it and the primary layer. The two did not interfere with each other, they coexisted. This suggested that the library contained multiple operational frameworks simultaneously, each accessible depending on perceptual orientation. The prince realized that what he had previously understood as a single system was actually a composite of interwoven systems, each reflecting different aspects of the same foundational design. He lowered the strip and allowed both networks to remain in partial awareness. The ability to hold multiple structural interpretations at once felt unstable at first, but gradually it became more manageable. Instead of merging them into one, he learned to maintain them as parallel references. This allowed him to perceive the library with greater depth, without collapsing its complexity into oversimplified understanding. He took another step forward, and the dual networks adjusted smoothly. Neither dominated the other. Instead, they responded to his position in complementary ways. The prince observed that movement within this environment did not favor one interpretation over another. It simply revealed different aspects depending on alignment. This reinforced the idea that the library was designed not for singular comprehension, but for sustained adaptability. He stopped again when he reached a point where both networks converged briefly. At this intersection, the structures did not merge permanently, but synchronized momentarily, creating a heightened clarity. When he raised the strip, the convergence appeared almost like a resonance point, where multiple layers aligned to express a unified pattern before separating again. The effect was brief, but significant. The prince lowered the strip and focused on retaining the memory of that alignment. Even without visual confirmation, the sense of convergence remained within his awareness. This suggested that certain structural experiences could persist internally without continuous reinforcement. The library was not only teaching him to see differently, it was teaching him to remember structure beyond perception. He stood still for a longer moment, allowing the dual networks, the anchors, and the convergence points to settle into a coherent internal model. The complexity of the system had not decreased, but his ability to navigate it had increased. He no longer felt overwhelmed by layers of perception. Instead, he felt increasingly synchronized with them, and in that quiet synchronization, he understood that he was approaching a deeper threshold, not one marked by physical transition, but by a shift in how fully he could remain aware of multiple layers at once without losing stability. The library was no longer something he was exploring from the outside. It was becoming the structure through which he was learning to perceive everything else. The prince remained within the synchronized overlap of the dual networks, allowing the lingering resonance of the convergence point to stabilize in his awareness before attempting any further movement. He no longer treated perception as something that fluctuated unpredictably, but as a structured field that responded to alignment and attention. Each layer of the library, whether primary or secondary, now felt less like separate systems and more like expressions of a unified architecture. The distinction between seeing and understanding had begun to blur into a single, continuous process. In this state, he no longer felt like someone entering knowledge, but someone adjusting within it. He took a measured step forward, and the shift that followed was subtle but significant. The dual networks did not fragment or collapse. Instead, they rebalanced themselves around his new position. The anchors he had previously identified adjusted their relative prominence, while the secondary structures gained temporary clarity before settling again into the background. This dynamic did not feel chaotic. It felt responsive, as though the system maintained equilibrium through constant, controlled variation. The prince observed that stability in this environment was not the absence of change, but the consistency of response to change. As he continued forward, he noticed that the reflective strip in his hand was becoming less essential for maintaining clarity. Its role had gradually shifted from revelation to confirmation, and now even that function felt partially internalized. The patterns he once required external validation for were now partially sustained within his own perception. When he briefly raised the strip, the networks confirmed what he already sensed. Alignment was no longer dependent on visual reinforcement alone. It was distributed across both tool and awareness. He lowered the strip and allowed his attention to expand naturally across the overlapping structures. The library responded by revealing additional depth within the existing networks. These were not new layers in the traditional sense, but refinements within the layers he had already encountered. Sub-patterns emerged within the anchors, suggesting that even fixed points contained internal variability. The prince realized that stability itself was recursive in this system, composed of smaller, self-adjusting components. He paused at a point where both networks exhibited a subtle divergence. The primary structure maintained its established pattern, while the secondary network introduced a slight variation in directionality. This divergence did not indicate contradiction, but differentiation. When he raised the strip, the variation became clearer. The same structural pathway existed in two slightly different forms, each valid within its own contextual alignment. The prince began to understand that the library did not present singular truths, but conditional expressions of structure. He lowered the strip again and focused on the internal sense of divergence. Even without visual aid, he could detect the separation between the two variations. This ability did not replace the strip, but complemented it, allowing him to engage with structure from multiple perceptual levels simultaneously. The experience was no longer about choosing between perspectives, but about maintaining awareness of their coexistence. The library rewarded this multiplicity of perception rather than resisting it. He moved forward slowly, and the environment adjusted once more. The divergence points began to align temporarily as he approached, creating moments of partial convergence followed by renewed separation. These transitions were not random. They appeared to be responsive to proximity and attention. The prince noted that his presence did not alter the structure directly, but influenced how it revealed itself. This reinforced his growing understanding that perception was an active component of the system, not a passive observation of it. At one of these transitional points, he stopped again and raised the reflective strip. The overlapping networks briefly synchronized into a clearer configuration, revealing a complex intersection where multiple structural pathways converged and diverged simultaneously. It was not a single node, but a dynamic junction where relationships between layers were continuously recalibrated. The prince observed that even this junction did not remain fixed in its configuration. It shifted subtly depending on the angle of observation. He lowered the strip and allowed the image to dissolve into internal awareness. The junction remained partially accessible without visual aid, though less defined. This persistence confirmed that the system was not dependent on continuous external confirmation. once sufficiently engaged. The prince was now carrying a partial internalization of the structure, allowing him to navigate without constant reference to the tool. This marked another shift in his relationship with the library, from dependent observation to integrated perception. He took another step forward, and the dual networks responded by expanding their relational complexity. The primary structure began to reveal secondary anchors within itself, while the secondary network introduced tertiary variations that mirrored earlier patterns. The repetition was not redundant, it was generative. Each level reflected the others, while introducing subtle modifications, creating a layered recursion that extended beyond immediate comprehension. The prince paused, realizing that he was now observing a system that did not simply contain knowledge, but generated variations of itself across perceptual layers. This meant that understanding the library was not about reaching a final interpretation, but about recognizing its capacity for continuous structural self-expression. Each observation was part of a larger process that did not terminate at comprehension, but extended through it. He raised the strip once more, but only briefly this time. The networks confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The recursion was not accidental. It was embedded intentionally, forming a self-referential system that maintained coherence through variation rather than rigidity. The prince saw that each structural layer acted both as a reflection and a transformation of the others, ensuring that no single perspective could exhaust the system's meaning. He lowered the strip and stood still, allowing this realization to settle fully. The complexity of the library no longer felt overwhelming, because he no longer expected it to resolve into simplicity. Instead, he understood that complexity itself was the stable condition of this environment. The challenge was not to reduce it, but to remain coherent within it. As he continued to stand there, the networks gradually stabilized around his presence, not by becoming simpler, but by aligning more consistently with his level of perception. The system did not flatten itself for him. It adjusted its expression to match his engagement. This subtle reciprocity deepened his understanding of how the library functioned, not as a repository of fixed truths, but as a responsive structure of layered interpretation. He took a final step forward into a region where the dual networks converged again, not fully, but enough to create a momentary clarity that unified multiple layers of perception. In that brief alignment, he understood that he was approaching another threshold, not of discovery, but of integration. And beyond that threshold, the library did not offer answers. It offered continuity. The prince remained within the region of partial convergence, allowing the lingering clarity from the overlapping networks to settle into a stable internal rhythm before making any further movement. The space around him no longer felt divided into separate layers in the same way as before. Instead, it behaved like a continuous field with varying degrees of expression, depending on attention and alignment. He understood now that each step he took did not uncover something new in isolation, but adjusted how the entire system presented itself. The library was no longer a sequence of discoveries. It was a continuous recalibration of perception. And within that understanding, he found a quieter, more sustained form of awareness beginning to emerge. He raised the reflective strip briefly, not to search, but to verify the consistency of what he was already sensing. The dual networks, along with their internal variations, appeared stable, but not fixed. Their relationships continued to shift subtly, maintaining coherence through motion rather than stillness. The anchors he had previously identified were still present, though they no longer functioned as absolute points. Instead, they acted as reference fields, adjusting slightly depending on his orientation. This subtle change confirmed that the system was not anchored in static structure, but in relational balance. As he lowered the strip again, he noticed that his internal perception had begun to retain more detail without external support. The patterns he once required visual confirmation for were now partially sustained within memory and spatial intuition. This did not eliminate the need for the tool entirely, but it reduced dependence on it. The prince recognized this as a transition point, not a conclusion, but a shift in how information was integrated. The library was no longer teaching him what to see, but how to maintain coherence while seeing differently. He took a slow step forward, and the environment responded in a way that was no longer surprising, but increasingly familiar. The networks adjusted around his movement, not by changing their structure, but by recalibrating their visibility. Certain pathways became more pronounced, while others faded into peripheral awareness. This dynamic suggested that the system was not revealing hidden content, but distributing attention across multiple layers simultaneously. The prince realized that movement in this space was less about direction and more about selection of perceptual emphasis. He paused again when he reached another region of subtle structural density. Unlike previous convergence points, this one did not present a clear intersection or figure. Instead, it manifested as a gradual thickening of relational patterns, where multiple layers overlapped without forming a single focal point. When he raised the strip, the complexity became more apparent, revealing not a node, but a field of interdependent variations. Each variation reflected a slightly different configuration of the same underlying structure. The prince studied this carefully, lowering and raising the strip in controlled intervals to observe how the system responded. Each adjustment did not change the structure itself, but altered the way its components became visible. He began to understand that what he was witnessing was not hierarchy, but modulation. The library did not prioritize one layer over another. It allowed all layers to coexist, with perception determining which became most prominent at any given moment. He lowered the strip and focused entirely on internal awareness once more. The field remained present, though less defined. Yet, even without visual reinforcement, he he could sense the density of relationships in this region. It was not precise, but it was stable enough to navigate. This growing internal stability marked another stage in his adaptation. The prince was no longer dependent on external confirmation for orientation. He was beginning to maintain structural awareness independently. He moved forward slowly, and the field responded with subtle shifts in emphasis. The overlapping variations did not resolve into a single form, but they became easier to interpret collectively. Instead of competing interpretations, they now appeared as complementary perspectives of a shared structure. This allowed him to perceive continuity where there had once been apparent fragmentation. The library was revealing itself not through reduction, but through integration. As he advanced further, he noticed a gradual emergence of directional coherence within the field. It was not a path in the traditional sense, but a tendency, a gradual alignment of patterns that suggested continuity in a particular orientation. When he raised the strip, this tendency became visually reinforced, appearing as a gentle gradient of structural density extending forward. The prince understood that this was not guidance in a literal sense, but a reflection of accumulated alignment. He followed this directional coherence cautiously, observing how it responded to his presence. The gradient did not accelerate or force movement. It simply remained consistent as long as he maintained awareness. When his attention shifted, the clarity of the gradient softened slightly. This confirmed once again that perception and structure were interdependent within the library. Nothing moved independently of observation. Everything adjusted through relational engagement. He paused within this gradient field, allowing both internal and external perception to synchronize. The reflective strip confirmed what he was already sensing: a sustained directional structure embedded within a broader recursive system. This structure did not appear to lead toward a single endpoint, but toward another layer of similar complexity. The prince began to understand that progression within the library was not linear, but iterative. Each region led not outward, but deeper into variations of the same underlying design. He lowered the strip and allowed the internal sense of direction to remain active without reinforcement. The gradient persisted, though less distinctly, yet still sufficient to guide his awareness. This ability to retain structural orientation without constant visual input marked another refinement in his engagement with the system. He was now operating within a hybrid mode of perception, where external and internal inputs functioned as parallel supports. He continued forward, and the field gradually became more structured again, though not simpler. Instead, the variations began to align into repeating motifs that suggested recursive organization. The prince recognized patterns that resembled earlier structures, but with slight modifications. These were not repetitions in the conventional sense, but iterations of the same framework expressed at different levels of complexity. He raised the strip briefly to confirm this observation. The repetition was indeed present, but layered in such a way that each iteration contained minor deviations. These deviations were not errors. They appeared intentional, suggesting that the system was designed to evolve through variation rather than stability. The prince realized that the library's architecture might not have a final form at all. Instead, it functioned as a continuously unfolding structure of recursive adaptation. He lowered the strip and stood still once more, absorbing the implications of this realization. The library was not something he was moving through toward an endpoint. It was something he was learning to remain within without losing coherence. Each layer, each network, each convergence point was not a destination, but a condition of awareness. As he remained in that quiet, structured stillness, the gradient ahead subtly shifted again, not as a change in direction, but as an invitation to continue engaging. The system did not close or conclude, it extended. And the prince, now increasingly attuned to its recursive nature, understood that what lay ahead would not resolve the structure he had already encountered. It would refine it further, into deeper continuity. The prince remained within the recursive gradient longer than before, allowing the layered structure around him to stabilize without forcing interpretation. The sense of direction that had once felt like a guide was now understood as a continuously shifting expression of internal alignment. He no longer treated the library as a place that presented answers, but as a system that refined perception through sustained engagement. Each variation in the field no longer appeared as separate information, but as a modulation of the same underlying continuity. Within this realization, his movement became less about searching and more about maintaining coherence within change. He raised the reflective strip once more, not out of necessity, but to compare the stability of internal perception with external confirmation. The gradient remained consistent, but the strip revealed subtle amplifications within the pattern that were not fully accessible through internal awareness alone. These amplifications did not alter the structure. They increased its resolution, allowing finer distinctions between overlapping variations. The prince observed that the system did not prioritize clarity in a single layer, but distributed it unevenly across levels, depending on alignment. This uneven distribution was not disorder, it was functional variation. As he lowered the strip again, he noticed that his internal model of the gradient had become more resilient. Even without visual reinforcement, he could maintain a stable sense of directional continuity. This did not eliminate uncertainty entirely, but it reduced fragmentation in perception. The library was gradually training him to sustain coherence across incomplete information. The prince realized that understanding here was not about achieving full visibility, but about remaining functional within partial visibility. He took a slow step forward, and the gradient responded in a familiar way. The directional structure did not shift abruptly, but adjusted its emphasis slightly, reinforcing the sense of forward continuity. prince noticed that this adjustment was no longer surprising to him. What once felt like an external response now felt like an internal-external synchronization. His presence did not alter the system directly, but influenced how the system distributed its clarity. This reciprocal relationship had become increasingly stable. He paused again when the gradient began to exhibit a secondary layering beneath its primary direction. This secondary layer was not immediately visible, but when he raised the strip, it became clearer. It suggested an alternative orientation embedded within the same structure, running parallel but not identical to the primary direction. The prince understood that this was not a contradiction, but a parallel expression of the same underlying system. The library was not singular in its directional logic. It was multidimensional in how it presented pathways. He lowered the strip and focused on the coexistence of both directional layers. Internally, they did not conflict. Instead, they formed a composite awareness where both could be held simultaneously without collapsing into confusion. This required a different kind of cognitive balance, one that did not prioritize one interpretation over another, but allowed both to remain active. The prince found that maintaining this balance required less effort over time as his perception adapted. He moved forward into the region where the dual directional layers intersected more frequently. The interaction between them created zones of increased complexity, not in terms of confusion, but in terms of informational density. When he raised the strip, these zones appeared as overlapping currents of structured variation, each influencing the other without fully merging. The prince observed that the system did not resolve these overlaps. It sustained them as part of its architecture. He lowered the strip again and allowed himself to experience the overlap without visual aid. The internal sense of structure confirmed the presence of both layers, though less distinctly. This dual awareness required him to remain attentive without fixation. If he focused too narrowly on one layer, the other receded. If he attempted to merge them, both became unstable. The correct engagement, he realized, was sustained parallel awareness. He adjusted his position slightly, not to follow either layer, but to remain centered between them. The effect was immediate but subtle. The overlapping structures stabilized relative to his awareness, creating a balanced field where both directional expressions remained accessible. This reinforced his understanding that the library was not guiding him toward a single truth, but training him to hold multiple truths without destabilization. He raised the strip briefly again, and the visualization confirmed this balance. The dual layers appeared evenly distributed around a shared structural axis, neither dominating the other. The prince observed that this axis was not fixed in space, but defined by perception itself. Wherever his awareness stabilized, the system reorganized around that point of balance. This meant that orientation within the library was not external, it was internalized through sustained perception. He lowered the strip and continued forward carefully, maintaining this central alignment. As he moved, the dual layers remained stable, no longer requiring constant adjustment. The system appeared to have adapted to his sustained engagement, allowing smoother transitions between overlapping structures. The prince recognized that this adaptation was not passive, it was conditional. The system responded to consistency in perception, not to force or urgency. He paused again when the gradient ahead began to compress slightly, as though the overlapping layers were converging into a denser region of structure. This compression did not reduce complexity, it intensified it. When he raised the strip, the region appeared as a highly concentrated field where multiple directional variations intersected at smaller intervals. The prince understood that this was not an endpoint, but a refinement zone where multiple layers interacted at higher resolution. He observed this region carefully, noting how each layer influenced the others without overriding them. The interactions were not hierarchical, but interdependent. Each variation contributed to the overall structure without dominating it. The prince realized that the library did not operate through dominance or reduction, but through sustained interrelation. Every part existed in relation to every other part, maintaining coherence through distributed interaction. He lowered the strip and focused entirely on internal awareness. The compression zone remained perceptible, though less defined. Yet, even without visual confirmation, he could sense its structural density. This reinforced his growing ability to navigate complex regions without constant reliance on external tools. The library was gradually integrating its perceptual requirements into his internal framework. He stepped into the compressed region, and the effect was immediate but controlled. The dual layers did not collapse. Instead, they refined further, revealing additional subvariations within each directional expression. The prince realized that complexity here did not increase outwardly, but inwardly. Each layer contained deeper subdivisions that required sustained attention to perceive. He raised the strip once more, and the visualization confirmed this inward refinement. What had previously appeared as two layers now contained multiple nested variations, each interacting with the others in precise but non-linear ways. The system did not simplify under scrutiny, it expanded in depth. The prince understood that perception was not uncovering a static structure, but engaging with a continuously deepening framework. He lowered the strip and allowed the full complexity to remain in internal awareness. Despite the increasing density, his perception remained stable. This stability was not due to simplification, but due to adaptation. He was no longer trying to resolve the system into something manageable. He was learning to remain coherent within its natural complexity. As he stood within the compressed convergence of layered direction, he realized that the library was no longer presenting itself as something to be explored. It was presenting itself as something to be sustained within. The prince remained within the compressed convergence longer than any previous region. allowing the intensified layering of directional structures to settle into a steady internal rhythm. The environment no longer felt like it was unfolding in front of him, but rather like it was unfolding through him. Each nested variation within the dual layers maintained its own identity, yet all of them shared a quiet dependency on his sustained awareness. He no longer experienced the library as something external that he moved through, but as something that reorganized itself around his continuity of perception. This subtle shift marked a deeper stage in his adaptation, where observation and participation were no longer separable. He raised the reflective strip again, though more out of habit than necessity, and the compressed field responded with heightened clarity. The nested variations that had previously appeared dense and overlapping now revealed a structured hierarchy of relationships, each level interacting with the others through controlled variation rather than conflict. The strip did not introduce new information. It refined what was already partially present within his internal awareness. The prince observed that every layer within the system was both dependent and independent at the same time, existing in a state that could only be understood through simultaneous perspectives. As he lowered the strip, he noticed that his internal perception no longer weakened in its absence. The structure remained intact within his awareness, though slightly less defined. This indicated a significant transition. External tools were no longer foundational, but supplementary. The library was gradually integrating its own perceptual mechanisms into his cognitive framework. The prince understood that this was not a sudden transformation, but the result of continuous alignment across multiple layers of engagement. He took a slow step forward into the densest part of the convergence, and the effect was immediate yet controlled. The nested variations did not collapse or shift abruptly. Instead, they reorganized their emphasis around his movement. Certain layers became more prominent while others receded, but none disappeared entirely. The system maintained its full complexity while adjusting visibility. The prince realized that movement here was not about traversing space, but about redistributing perceptual weight across existing structures. He paused again when he sensed a deeper structural pattern emerging beneath the nested layers. It was not a new layer in the conventional sense, but an underlying continuity that connected all variations at once. When he raised the strip, this underlying pattern became faintly visible as a unifying framework that held the entire compressed field together. The prince observed that this framework did not interfere with the variations. It sustained them. It was not dominant, but foundational in a non-hierarchical way. He lowered the strip and focused on retaining the awareness of this underlying continuity. Even without visual confirmation, the sense of structural unity remained present, though less sharply defined. This reinforced his growing understanding that the library operated on multiple simultaneous principles, none of which excluded the others. Complexity, stability, and variation were not separate functions. They were interdependent expressions of the same system. He moved forward again, and the nested variations responded with subtle recalibration. The deeper he entered the convergence, the more the layers began to exhibit synchronized behavior. They did not merge, but their interactions became more coordinated, as if the system was reducing friction between parallel expressions. The prince noticed that this synchronization did not reduce complexity. It refined it into greater coherence. He stopped at a point where the underlying framework became more pronounced than the surrounding variations. This was not a new convergence point, but a stabilization zone where multiple layers aligned temporarily without losing their individuality. When he raised the strip, the structure appeared almost crystalline in its organization, with each layer contributing to a larger integrated pattern. The prince understood that this was not a final form, but a temporary state of equilibrium within a dynamic system. He lowered the strip and allowed himself to remain within this equilibrium without external reinforcement. The structure persisted in his awareness, though less vividly. Yet, even in reduced clarity, its coherence remained intact. This confirmed that the library's most stable features were not those that were most visible, but those that were most consistently aligned with perception over time. He took another careful step forward, and the equilibrium shifted slightly. The synchronized layers began to separate again, not chaotically, but gradually, returning to their previous nested variations. The prince observed that this separation was not a loss of structure, but a return to a more flexible state. Stability within the library was not permanent, it was cyclical. The system moved between coherence and variation depending on engagement. He raised the strip once more, confirming this transition. The layers had resumed their nested structure, but now with a clearer sense of internal order. Each variation retained its position within the broader framework, suggesting that the earlier equilibrium had reinforced their relational stability. The prince realized that even temporary synchronization had lasting effects on the system's organization. He lowered the strip and stood still, allowing both the memory of equilibrium and the return of variation to coexist in his awareness. This dual retention required careful balance, but it had become increasingly natural to him. The library no longer overwhelmed his perception. It expanded it, gradually increasing his capacity to hold complexity without fragmentation. He remained in place as the nested layers continued their subtle oscillation between variation and partial alignment. The prince understood that he was now operating within a phase of the library where structure was no longer something to be discovered, but something to be continuously sustained through attention. Each moment of awareness contributed to the stability of what he perceived. As he looked deeper into the compressed convergence, he sensed that this region was approaching another threshold, not a physical boundary, but a perceptual one. The nested layers began to thin slightly at the edges, suggesting a transition beyond the current structure. He did not move immediately, but he recognized that the system was preparing to shift again. And in that quiet recognition, the prince understood that the library was not guiding him toward an end, but preparing him for a deeper continuity beyond the final layer he had reached so far. The prince remained at the edge of the perceptual threshold longer than any previous moment, not because he hesitated, but because the compressed convergence had begun to behave differently from everything he had encountered so far. The nested layers no longer oscillated in clear cycles of variation and alignment. Instead, they moved toward a slow dissolution of distinction. It was not collapse nor disappearance, but a gradual blending of boundaries that made separation increasingly difficult to define. He understood that this was not the end of structure, but the beginning of a different kind of continuity. One that no longer relied on visible layering to exist. He raised the reflective strip for what he instinctively recognized would be the final time in its familiar function. The result was unlike anything before. Instead of revealing clearer structure, the strip showed a diminishing of contrast between layers, as though the system itself was refusing to prioritize any single level of perception. The nested variations, once distinct and measurable in relation to one another, now appeared as overlapping gradients without fixed boundaries. The prince realized that the tool was no longer separating truth from illusion, or structure from variation. It was showing their gradual convergence into a unified perceptual field. As he lowered the strip slowly, he noticed that his internal awareness did not lose clarity. Instead, it reorganized itself to match what the tool had shown. The distinction between external confirmation and internal perception had become nearly irrelevant. What remained was a continuous awareness that no longer required separation between observation and understanding. The library had not removed the need for tools. It had absorbed their function into perception itself. The prince stood within that realization without resistance, as if it had always been the intended direction of his journey. He took a single step forward into the dissolving convergence, and the effect was immediate but subtle. The structured layers did not collapse, but they ceased to present themselves as separate systems. The nested variations merged into a unified field of relationships that could no longer be divided without losing coherence. The prince felt no sense of disorientation, only an expansion of interpretive depth. It was no longer possible to identify where one layer ended and another began, because the concept of layers itself had become irrelevant within this space. He paused again, but there was no longer a clear distinction between stopping and continuing. Even in stillness, the field remained active, and even in movement, it remained stable. The prince realized that the threshold he had reached was not a boundary in space, but a transition in mode of perception. The library was no longer presenting structures to be interpreted. It was presenting continuity itself as the primary condition of awareness. Everything he had learned so far had been preparation for this shift in understanding. He lowered his hand completely, no longer relying on the reflective strip at all. Yet nothing diminished. The field remained fully present, but without segmentation. The prince could still sense relational depth, but it was no longer organized into layers or networks. Instead, it existed as a continuous fabric of interdependent awareness. Every point contained relation to every other point, not through visible connection, but through inherent coherence. This was not complexity reduced. It was complexity unified. He moved forward once more, and movement itself felt different now. It no longer produced changes in perception. Instead, it revealed that change had already been integrated into the field. There was no longer a distinction between approaching and arriving, between observing and being observed. The library had reached a state where interaction and existence were indistinguishable. The prince understood that he was no longer navigating within it. He was participating in its continuity. As he continued, a final realization began to settle, not as information, but as recognition. The library had never been a place containing hidden knowledge waiting to be found. It had been a structured process designed to transform the manner in which knowledge itself could exist within perception. Every figure, every convergence, every layered variation had been stages of adaptation, gradually dissolving the need for separation between observer and structure. He stopped once more, though even the concept of stopping felt incomplete. The field around him remained entirely coherent without reference points. There was no central convergence anymore, because everything had become equally central. The prince understood that what he had been calling the library was no longer external to him in any meaningful sense. It was a sustained condition of awareness that now included him as part of its structure. In that final stillness, there was no revelation, no dramatic closure, no final object or answer waiting to be revealed. Instead, there was continuity without boundary, structure without division, and awareness without separation. The journey did not end because it had nowhere left to go. It ended because the idea of going had dissolved into a continuous state of being within the system itself. And in that quiet, complete integration, the prince understood the final truth the library had been guiding him toward all along. Not a secret to be uncovered, but a way of existing where discovery and existence were no longer different things.